Welcome to The Big Picture with Katrina Fulcher-Rude and Ani Castilla-Earls, where they discuss how research in speech-language pathology can be implemented in daily clinical practice. Hi everyone, and welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Katrina.
And I am Annie.
And we want to welcome you to our third episode. And you could see the background's a little bit different. We are no longer in Buffalo, New York in my dining room. We are at Denver, Colorado for the ASHA 2015 convention.
And we are recording this episode from our
hotel room.
We have been looking around for a place where to record this video, and I think this is the best choice we have. So we know we have a funky background today, but this is the best we can. We also wanted to let you know that we are working on improving our videos. We know we need to improve a little bit the quality of the sounds, and we hope that you will see some improvements in the videos to come.
So please just stick with us. Remember, we're clinicians and researchers, and unfortunately, not Steven Spielberg. So we're trying the best that we can. So please grow with us as we make our improvements. What we wanted to start talking about today was actually a topic that came about as I was telling Ani about a new topic I was discussing with some undergraduate students of mine. And what we were discussing was how in the school system or in general, how do people usually define or what labels are typically used when we're talking about children with language disorders. And a lot of different definitions came up, but one that was particularly difficult for them to understand was the diagnosis of specific language impairment. And when we began talking, we thought that this would be a great topic to bring to you, our big picture audience, especially because we know a lot of you SLPs out there are school-based SLPs and will actually encounter these children on your caseload.
Absolutely. So the issue with the term SLI, or specific language impairment, is that it's a term that is more used in the research literature than in the clinical field. So children with SLI are often the children that you identify as children with an expressive disorder, or sometimes with an expressive and receptive disorder. It is important from research purposes and also from clinical purpose to differentiate these children, because the key issue with these kids, is that there is nothing explaining the language disorder. So these children have normal hearing, normal cognitive skills, and no other associated diagnosis.
And I think that was the key for my students and for other things that I was seeing when I was in my school-based placement. You know, they were very familiar with language deficits that could come about from autism or say intellectual disability, but those aren't the children that we're really speaking about here.
No, correct. So these are children whose only difficulty is at the language level. Everything else is normal.
So with language being the primary concern, can you talk a little bit about how do these children look, or typically what are their main language issues that children with specific language impairment are experiencing?
Absolutely. So the main difficulties that children with specific language impairment experience are at the grammatical and syntactical level. So these children are children who produce grammatical errors, and that usually produce sentences that are short or not very complex. Okay, so this is the main difficulty. What is interesting is some of the children with SLI also experiences difficulties with vocabulary, but not every child. Okay, so also children with SLI, some of them might experience difficulties with pragmatics or with phonology, but not every child experiences difficulties. The main characteristic of children with specific language impairments is at the grammar and syntactic level.
And we're definitely going to come back to that grammar and syntactic level, but what is the prevalence of SLI? How many kids on a caseload should our speech pathologists out there be expecting?
So we know from prevalence studies that the prevalence of SLI is between 6 and 8%. Is more prevalent for boys than for girls. So you're more likely to see a boy with SLI than a girl with SLI. But think about it, Kat, 7%. So that means 7 children per every 100 children in your class, in your school, will have SLI.
So with a number like that for every 100 students, we're going to have 7 students with specific language impairment. I definitely think it's the case that some of our viewers out there are really working with children that have specific language impairment. And from talking with you, Ani, this is something that usually goes undiagnosed, or sometimes these kids aren't being diagnosed and receiving treatment services.
That is true. And the reason why is because since the main difficulty is the grammatical part or the syntactic part, Kat, that often goes unnoticed, right? You can identify clearly a child who has a phonological problem or an artic difficulty. You hear them and they sound different. But when a child has a grammatical difficulty or syntactic difficulties, sometimes people associate that child with they're maybe not very smart, right? With cognitive deficits, or maybe they think that they don't come from a family that they speak the language well, but is not associated usually well, this child might need a speech language pathologist, right?
And that's especially true. We know that teachers are some of the primary referral sources. And so if they're not picking up on those grammatical markers, then it's possible that you're not even having these children recommended to even begin that evaluation.
Absolutely. That is definitely the case.
And so what's going to be the impact for these students if they're not identified and they're not actually receiving treatment services for their specific language impairment?
So something else that we know from the research literature is that a specific language impairment is a pervasive disorder. Do you know what that means, Karen?
From my standpoint, with the pervasive disorder, this is not something that's going to go away. That means that these language difficulties that these children have is something that's going to follow them into adulthood and will be having social ramifications, educational ramifications, vocational ramifications, and even at the economic level.
Absolutely. So these children, when we provide them with therapy, what we're doing is we're trying to help them with the development of language, and they actually benefit from it. But they often do not pair up with typically developing children. You always see that gap through their lives.
So, Ani, I know that one of the hallmark features of children with specific language impairment is they're going to have difficulty with grammar and those syntactical elements. So can we let our speech pathologists know what should they be looking for in terms of grammar when they're either collecting that language sample, observing a child, seeing them talking with friends? What should we be on the lookout for?
Well, there are specific grammatical markers for SLI. Some of them are very easy to identify. So let's start with the marking of the past tense, regular past tense markings. So when children are talking in the past, they will say something like, yesterday I walked to school.
And so children with SLI, they're going to omit or completely delete that ending ED. So they might say, yesterday I walk to school, instead of yesterday I walked to school.
Correct. They will also tend to omit the marking of the third person singular. So we'll say something like, she walks to school. If it's a child with language impairment, they will say something like,
she walked to school.
Correct, even though it's a marking in the present and we are referring to the third person. Another type of grammatical errors that these children often commit is omission of the verb to be. So when I'm talking about the verb to be, I'm referring to those I am, you are, he is, she is, we are, we were, she was. So children usually omit it in cases where they're using the verb to be as a copula, as in I am happy, or sometimes they also omit it in cases where it's used as an auxiliary, as I am running to you.
So if a typical child said I am happy, what would the child with SLI say?
They probably will say something like I happy.
So they're completely omitting those to be forms.
Or they might be saying something like I running.
Oh, okay. Are there other grammatical markers that our speech pathologists can be on the lookout for?
These are the ones that are most supported by research findings. We also know that children with specific language impairments tend to make shorter sentences, so their MLU is going to be below limits or below typically developing peers, and also their sentences tend to be simpler. So they are children who are not going to produce a lot of subordinated sentences or using, for example, relative clauses.
And one thing that I think is interesting, we've been talking a lot that this is SLI is something that goes undiagnosed or might not be used in clinical practice. So when is SLI actually recognized, or when can that label actually be used?
So we often see this diagnosis happening between the ages of 4 and 8, I would say. So it's not that the diagnosis disappears after age 8. What happens is in the schools, these kids get diagnosed now with a language learning disability. So a language learning disability is language is impacting directly their ability to learn the content in the classroom.
And so with this diagnosis of specific language impairment happening around that 4 years of age mark, what are these children like before 4 years of age? How are they typically identified then?
So we know that children with SLI are often also diagnosed as late talkers around age 2, right? So these are kids with very few words behind other children who are maybe late to start combining words, right? So from the beginning, these children are late in start learning words, combining words, and producing grammatical markers later on.
Great. And we know that this is a lot of information, especially if specific language impairment isn't something that you're familiar with. So we want to just summarize and review, give you those research quick tips and strategies so that you can start thinking about specific language impairment in your own clinical practice. So when thinking about specific language impairment, Ani, what's the first thing to think about?
So think always these are kids with difficulties at the grammatical and syntactical level, and this is their main characteristic.
And when thinking about those grammar and syntactical markers, you're going to be looking for omission of past tense, omission of that third person singular. What else?
And the omission of copulates and auxiliaries from the verb to be.
And really make sure that we are trying to diagnose specific language impairment because it is a pervasive disorder, and these are children that are always going to have difficulties with language, and that could have lifelong lasting impacts.
So if you have any questions for us, please email us at
thebigpicturevlog@gmail.com, which you'll be seeing at the end of this episode. You could also feel free to leave a comment below for us on YouTube.
And now we also have a Facebook page, and we created this Facebook page as a way to keep in touch with you, so you can see easily in your feed when we publish a new video for you.
And so on Facebook, you could also find us at The Big Picture Vlog. And if you don't want to miss a video, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and YouTube will send you out notifications when we post our weekly videos.
And this is The Big Picture.
Thanks a lot, and keep thinking about the big picture.